We're in Brooklyn at the SEforALL Forum. I'm William Brent from Power4All, and I'm here with two of my colleagues, Christine Skierka, who's the campaign director for Power4All, and Rebecca Shirley, who's the director of research. And I guess a good place to start, Christina, would be to tell us a little bit about Power4All. I know that Power4All was launched 2 years ago at the SEforALL Forum, also in New York, I believe. And it's been 2 years since then. So tell us a little bit about the organization and what you guys are doing.
Or us guys.
What we guys are doing. Exactly.
Yeah, so it's a great thing to mention that we did launch 2 years ago at the SEforALL Forum, and at that time on the stage from the dais at the UN, we committed to do one thing, which was to push and to really keep banging the drum for decentralized renewable energy, which we've absolutely done. And today, starting from where we were 2 years ago, we're a coalition now of over 170 campaign partners, working across three particular and distinct kinds of activity. And one is the communications that William Brent does for all of us. So all the infographics and exciting stories that you hear are definitely his brainchild. And then in addition, we also do market activation, which is our in-country work. If anybody wants information on our work that we do in countries, in particular Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria, you can actually find that on our website at power4all.org. And that sort of campaigning on the ground, I think, is one of the things that has been really exciting over the last 2 years. And then finally, the global advocacy work. And that might be a nice tie-in to what we're going to talk about today. But the idea with global advocacy is really to focus on those big levers of change that can really make a difference if they change their institutional frameworks. So that includes MDBs, multilateral development banks, it includes decision makers, policy makers, these sorts of things. And incredible success over the last 2 years, and it wouldn't have been possible without the support of all the partners that we work with and the real enthusiasm of the companies that are engaged in this sector trying to accelerate the path to universal energy access.
Yeah, so almost 200 companies, civil society organizations, trade associations, financial institutions really pushing hard to achieve energy access by 2025 through decentralized renewables.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the conversations we've heard here a lot at this event is how important energy is, in particular, to achieving all the other SDGs. And without energy in place by 2025, the hopes and dreams for 2030 will be incredibly hard, if not impossible, to meet.
So you mentioned the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank. I mean, these are big organizations that deploy billions of dollars every year. Power4All, I know, is structured around what we call calls to action. We did our first call to action last year that was targeted at the development banks to really try and help push those institutions to allocate more of their investment money into decentralized renewable energy so that we can achieve energy access sooner. So can you maybe back up for a second before we get into what we announced yesterday at our launch and explain what we did last year with the development banks and why that was important?
I'm happy to, and I do want to get Rebecca engaged so the audience doesn't just hear my voice. But in particular, we knew that we needed to do something to really sort of challenge the way that a lot of energy is developed in emerging markets. And that largely happens through multilateral development banks. They're lending and they're working with local countries and government officials. The sad but true reality is that most of what is afforded by these institutions is really traditional approaches to energy. So that includes centralized grids. And Rebecca knows herself about the sort of time dimensions of that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of issues we raised last year with
one of the things that we found in our study that Christine was talking about last year is that actually, and these are World Bank numbers, the World Bank finds that on average, centralized grid extension or expansion projects take about 9 years from beginning to completion. And that's a really long time to be waiting for energy access, regardless of the tier. And so that was one of the things that we found was to be most striking was that distributed renewables can really advance energy access a lot faster than grid extension projects can. And that was sort of one of the major, that led to one of the major calls of the paper last year. So.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are pretty stark, right? I mean, I think none of the development banks invest, up till 2014 anyway, invested more than 2%, I believe, of their money on decentralized renewable energy. And we know that the International Energy Agency, for example, has said very clearly that 60% of all unelectrified connections have to be made by either standalone systems or mini grids, right?
Yeah.
So a 2% investment versus a 60% problem, clearly something has to change, right? So that's what that's the finance piece, right? Which is really.
And let me just add to that. I mean, one of the things we try to do with the calls to action is to create permanent change. And so one of the great outcomes of launching this initiative with the MDBs was the creation of what was formerly known as the Energy Access Opportunity Cost, which has now been formalized into the Energy Access Dividend. And essentially what we're doing is we're trying to bring in some of the sort of standards theories of economic modeling for people to really change their framework for decision making. And we believe that it's essential to actually assign a value to the opportunity cost of late access. So in other words, what is the impact on human beings who have to wait 9 years to achieve any level of modern energy access, waiting for the grid, which is, as we know, unreliable in many of the countries that we're talking about. But how can we actually put a number on that to change decision-making frameworks? And as a great result, we are now launching with SEforALL and some other institutions, including Acumen, is on the steering committee, obviously our research director herself, and other entities, GOGLA, to really sort of formalize this structure and this decision making, and that's our permanent change.
That's going to be exciting. I think we'll have a good initial framework later this year. So keep in touch with us about that. So that's a nice segue to the call to action that we launched yesterday. So we know that getting access to finance is a critical piece to scaling DRE, decentralized renewable energy, and achieving energy access. Another critical piece of that is policy at the national level, and really trying to make sure that the pieces are in place within a country to achieve energy access. So our call to action yesterday was focused on that. Rebecca, do you want to talk a little bit more about sort of how that was framed out and how we're thinking about that?
Sure, absolutely. And I think you're right that sort of, beyond this finance sort of call, we wanted to speak specifically to policy. Because what we find is that, although there is this sort of generally broad acceptance or agreement that rural electrification has to be a big part of universal energy access, what we find is that if you actually look at countries where rural electrification is one of the biggest challenges, so you take a look, for instance, at countries where you've got 50% or more of the rural population without having access to electricity, what you find is that makes up about 80% of the 1.2 billion that this is the kind of number that you hear at conferences like these all the time, right? So 1.2 billion people without access to electricity, and 80% of that is in rural communities. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you say, okay, let's take a look at the policy in those particular countries. What you find is that actually they tend to be very challenged or lack policy focus on rural electrification. And then further, lack focus on the potential for or the opportunities that DRE represents, or lack focus on that. We found that by doing just a very, very quick sort of back of the envelope calculation. If you look for all of the energy access targets, universal energy access targets, national electrification targets, rural electrification targets, DRE targets for these particular countries, what you find is that more than half of them don't have targets at all. About 40% of them have rural electrification targets, and only about 23% of them actually have DRE-focused targets. Yeah. So we think that there's a really large gap there. It means that these are the countries that could most benefit from these kinds of targets and focus on rural electrification and DRE. But these are the ones that kind of need the most push. Yeah. And so that was sort of the basis for this paper. We were asking the question, if these are the countries that could really benefit from catalyzing DRE markets, what are the best practice policies that need to be in place to cause that,
right.
To cause that revolution?
You looked at 5 of the best performing countries, markets in terms of decentralized renewable energy to try and dig out what those policy levers were, right?
Yeah.
I think people had an anecdotal concept of what they might be, but nobody had actually done the hard research and analysis to actually say, clearly that we know that these types of policies will lead to high growth, right? So, or correlate, yeah.
There is a doctor in the house.
You guys always nail me on that one. So, I mean, talk about those 5 countries. Talk about what you discovered from doing that analysis.
Right. Well, what we wanted to do was to speak to those least energy access countries, or that group that I was talking about just now. We wanted to say, let's take a look at countries where DRE markets are performing really, really well and see what's working there. So we used basically the most up-to-date data on sales for PV, for Pico PV and solar home systems as sort of a proxy for where DRE markets are doing well. And using that metric, we found that countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania in sub-Saharan Africa, and India and Bangladesh in Southeast Asia tend to be the largest markets right now. So the most active markets in terms of sales. So we said, all right, if we take that subset of 5 countries, let's look at what their policy implementation has been and how well they've done on policy implementation, and then maybe we can extract from that the policies that are most important or best correlate with growth. So we used another data set, Climascope. Some of you might be familiar with it, but this is it's a tool that's put out by BNEF, or Bloomberg New Energy Finance, that basically scores countries on their policy as it relates to creating enabling environments for clean energy investment. So we extracted all of the policies that relate to DRE and basically just did a regression. That just means we looked at the relationship between those policies and their performance on those policies, sort of like on an x-axis, and market growth on a y-axis. And what you see is that there's actually a few policies that correlate very strongly, meaning you've got very positive growth or very positive slopes. And so some of those were, there were 5 that we found that were really, really important. Focus first and foremost on finance, as you were mentioning before. A reduction of import duties and tariffs tends to correlate very, very well with market growth. So that means that in countries where you have very high market growth, you tend to have very, very low tariffs, sometimes zeroed out entirely for solar products, batteries, that sort of thing. We also found technical regulation to be very important. So countries that had mini-grid regulations, permitting and licensing standards very clearly laid out, they tended to do very well. We also found that policy is very important. So rural electrification plans and targets, which is kind of where we started this whole conversation, also correlate very well. And the last one was adoption of quality control standards. So, making sure that all of the product that's in the market, or at least as much as possible of the product that's in the market is vetted, it's quality, and so helps to kind of create, trust in the products themselves.
That's great. So, so for the first time, essentially, national governments can know pretty clearly that there are 5 things that they can do to actually, that will most likely correlate to market growth for decentralized renewable energy, right? So that's an exciting thing to, that's exciting to find out, right?
But statistics.
We know that more than half of the countries don't have many of the things that they need to have, especially rural electrification targets. But now we know that they can do 5 things that will probably lead to a rapid market growth. But we didn't want to stop there, right? We wanted to actually say to national governments, here's what you can do, and then what else did we want to do?
Yeah, so it's a great point. Again, research is nothing if it isn't correlated with action, right? And so that's really the idea behind having calls to action. And essentially what our focus was to provide some very actionable things that a couple of targets could do. And one thing in particular with national governments is to create these targets. So we've talked a lot about it, but the truth is, and I think this is consistent whether it's in a developed market or developing market, that having a signal like that for a market is really important. And so for us, setting a decentralized renewable energy target, setting a national energy access target, those are all things that we've asked governments to do. In addition, another strong suggestion is to pursue integrated energy planning. So unfortunately, where we're at right now is people, first of all, still use the term off-grid, but that's something we're really trying to sort of move in another direction towards, because we actually feel like decentralized renewable energy targets and the market itself are in fact a critical part of an overall approach to supplying a given country with energy. So having a way to integrate these different streams of energy and how they can work together can actually create a puzzle that's much easier and faster to put together. And then the last topic, of course, is to do collaborative stakeholder policy design. And we think that's incredibly important for two reasons. One is that the technology's changed a lot and the stakeholders are growing. This market is really expanding quite quickly. And at the same time, we've got governments actually expecting companies to deliver on their national electrification targets. You see that in Rwanda, you'll be seeing that in Ethiopia, you'll see it in a number of countries, especially those that have signed the Energy Africa compacts. But then just simply giving, a regulation or putting things in place without actually engaging the sector itself and creating the right enabling environment, it's not going to be a ticket for success. So those are really the three big things that we've done in our call to actions to governments. And if you look at our paper, which is available on our website, powerforall.org, you'll also see that there's also call outs for others to do. And that includes for the sector itself, a level of engagement, as well as for donors and the kind of funding that we need around data and information to really be able to track where this sector is going successfully.
Yeah, and just to call this out, I mean, one of the things that Christina was talking about was multi-stakeholder engagement. And we've got clear, specific recommendations within the findings around how to best do that through a task force. So, what else? I mean, so we've got the how, we've got the why, we've got the what, and we've got the how, right? So where will Power for All go from here in terms of? We've done this in Nigeria or in Zimbabwe, or we're doing it. It's in process. Sierra Leone. What's the vision for the future?
Well, it's a great question, and I guess what I would step back and say too is that, what have we done? We've helped catalyze some change and some players that are already in place. There's so much great work being done on the ground, and being able to sort of galvanize that and focus it on very specific, demarcated things that we know are correlated with making a difference, I think is what we do best. So we're meant to be catalysts. We're not meant to be, any sort of permanent inhabitants per se of any particular effort. But I would say that it's probably best encapsulated in what we call our 25 by 25 strategy. So based on the research that we've done in this white paper, which you can find on powerforall.org, we really lay out the countries we think that can become tipping point countries. The idea here is for us to help, for a concentrated moment in time, really make enough change, create enough momentum that then the people who live in those countries themselves can just take the ball and run with it. So we have a target list of 25 countries where we'd really like to focus our next efforts on, but that also is in complement to the ongoing work of communications done by this fine young man, and also by our global advocacy team on those big levers of change.
Yeah. If we have time to talk just a minute about Sierra Leone, I think, if we look at the work that we've done so far on the ground to really activate markets, I think Sierra Leone for me is a really good shining example of that. We've been active in Sierra Leone for 9 months maybe. What's happened?
Yeah, thanks for the tee up there. Sierra Leone's a great sort of tipping point case study. I mean, essentially, in partnership with Energy Africa, with the Ministry of Energy, with other stakeholders on the ground, including SOBA and others, in less than a year, Sierra Leone has completely changed its outlook from a decentralized renewable energy perspective. And again, it maps to the research that we've done, right? So this is real-world experience. And less than a year ago, Sierra Leone and the government ministry there took on the commitment to deliver Power for All by 2025.
Right, they call it the energy revolution, right?
Exactly. And what unleashed as part of that commitment and the support of the Energy Africa Compact was an effort that was led by an institutionalized decentralized renewable energy or energy revolution task force that our campaign manager on the ground, Ami Doumbaya, has led for us. And in addition, it's also helped put in the kinds of critical policy enablers in place that we know make a difference and have been seen to make a difference. So in other words, creating this green lane, a quick way to get through import taxes, general services tax, et cetera, but then also putting some of that supporting environment in place, whether it is a really well-organized and thought-out rural electrification plan, getting all the chiefdoms involved, etc., or doing an awareness campaign in cooperation with partners on the ground there. But basically what we've been seeing as a result of this is unbelievable exponential levels of growth in the sector. In a country that never had a multinational focus on this sector involved before, now there's almost 10, including Total's Awango products, D-Light, B-Box, Ignite Solar. It's a long list that have all literally in just a few months showed up and made a difference, and we've just been seeing adoption levels of these products and therefore energy access go off the charts.
Yeah, no, it's a great example and case study, which we'll be sharing more about. Well, I think anything else that you wanted to cover or wanted to point out in terms of?
I'd say that the other thing that's really interesting about this white paper, which you can find on powerforall.org, is that what we're finding in the statistics, or basically what we're seeing in the evidence, is also really well correlated with what's in the perspectives that are reflected from our stakeholders, our partners. So we also did this stakeholder survey of companies, practitioners that are working in those 5 countries, and the really interesting thing was we were asking them, tell us, what are the policies, what are the technical regulations, what are the finance measures, the finance tools that really influence the ability that your company has to work in market, or would influence the ability that your company has to work in market if they were in place? And the kinds of things that people ranked as their number one national energy policy or technical regulation maps perfectly to what we found in the correlation study. So I just wanted to point out that there's the evidence in the numbers, but there's also the evidence as on the ground, and they map very well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think Power for All wouldn't be Power for All without the partners that make it up. So that's the companies, it's the civil society groups, and having their perspective from the the front lines is critical to actually achieving the type of change that we want to achieve. How about you? Any last? What's your dream for 2017 and 2018?
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal here is to just scale what we're doing. Again, I mean, we've got this 25 by 25 strategy, and I think actioning on that is the hope and dream. Another 3 countries maybe this year, we'll see. But I think, also looking forward to our next call to action, which is going to be focused more on one of the topics we raised in this first paper here, or in the second paper, which is really about this sort of integrated approach to energy and the utilities of the future. It is absolutely going to be a pluralistic society that's got democratized energy written all over it.
Great, that's exciting. I like that. Good. Well, so thank you for joining us today. As Christina said, if you want to learn more about Power for All, you can find it at powerforall.org. We are a partner-driven campaign. If you are interested in joining us, please let us know. We'd love to get your engagement in this really important endeavor. And here's to achieving universal energy access by 2030. And thanks again to the... Sorry, to 2025. Did I say 2030?
Off message. The comms guy is off message.
Thanks to Rachel Kite and her team at SEforALL for putting together this amazing forum. We're really excited to work with you on the Energy Access Dividend. Stay tuned and come visit us at Power for All.